What if the Manhattan Project had failed? Imagine this. The year is 1945. In a hidden desert in New Mexico, a device unlike anything the world has ever seen is about to be tested. The countdown reaches 0. But nothing happens. The Manhattan Project, the secret American effort to build the atomic bomb, has failed. Now ask yourself, what if the atomic bomb was never built? How would World War II have ended? Would the world have avoided the nuclear age altogether? Or would another country have unleashed this devastating power first? Today, we're going to explore a world where history took a very different turn. This is What If the Manhattan Project Had Failed? Let's travel back to the late 1930s, a time when the world was teetering on the edge of chaos. Adolf Hitler had plunged Europe into war, and nations everywhere scrambled to prepare for what could become the deadliest conflict in human history. But amidst the tanks, planes, and battleships, a far more terrifying weapon was about to emerge. It all started with a discovery in the laboratories of Europe. Scientists found that when the nucleus of an atom, particularly uranium or plutonium, was split in a process called nuclear fission, it released an enormous amount of energy. In theory, this energy could be harnessed to create a single bomb with the destructive power of thousands of tons of TNT. And in 1939, two physicists who had fled Nazi Germany, Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, wrote a now famous letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Their warning was chilling. Germany might be working on such a bomb. And if they built it first, the consequences could be unimaginable. Roosevelt took the warning seriously. What followed was one of the most ambitious and secretive projects in human history, the Manhattan Project. This wasn't just another weapons program. It was a desperate scientific race against the clock, where the very fate of the world might hang in the balance, under the leadership of theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, often called the father of the atomic bomb, and military engineer General Leslie Groves. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada mobilized some of the brightest minds of the 20th century. Over 130,000 people worked on the project at its peak. Entire towns, like Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, were built from scratch and kept hidden from the public eye. And the price tag? Over $2 billion at the time, which would be equivalent to more than $30 billion today. But despite the money, manpower, and brainpower, success was never guaranteed. The challenges were enormous. Nuclear fission was brand new. Scientists weren't even sure the reactions could be controlled in a bomb-sized device. Separating uranium-235 from natural uranium was a monumental technical nightmare. Industrial-scale uranium enrichment, using centrifuges, gaseous diffusion, and electromagnetic separation, had never been done before. Is deep going? Producing plutonium in nuclear reactors was also untested. Scientists at Hanford, Washington, struggled with dangerous radiation leaks and mechanical failures. Even if they managed to produce enough fissile material, the next question was, how do you detonate it? The plutonium bomb, in particular, required a perfectly symmetrical implosion system, a brand new concept in explosive engineering. And then there was the risk of failure, or worse, a catastrophic accident that could kill the scientists and release radioactive material into the environment. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Imagine for a moment if some of those challenges had proved insurmountable. Maybe the centrifuges in Oak Ridge kept breaking down, never producing enough enriched uranium. Maybe the reactor at Hanford melted down or failed to produce usable plutonium. Maybe the complicated implosion mechanism for the plutonium bomb never worked, and test after test ended in failure. And let's not forget about wartime sabotage. What if German spies, Japanese agents, or even anti-nuclear activists within the U.S. had managed to derail production or leak secrets to enemy nations? Or what if natural disasters or supply chain failures, remember, this was a global war, delayed crucial components from reaching their destination? In this alternate timeline, by mid-1945, the Manhattan Project would be running out of time and options. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Japan was still fighting fiercely in the Pacific. American troops were preparing for a massive, bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands. The hope of ending the war quickly with a single, devastating strike was fading fast. Without the atomic bomb ready, President Truman and his generals would be forced to rely on conventional weapons, naval blockades, and full-scale ground invasions. Soviet forces, having just defeated Germany, were beginning to eye their own advances into Asia. The United States, despite pouring billions of dollars and countless hours into the Manhattan Project, was losing the race against both time and history. The question then becomes, how would this failure ripple through the rest of the war? What strategies would America turn to? And what kind of world would emerge from a conflict where nuclear weapons never made their terrible debut? As we move into Part 2, we'll explore how the final days of World War II could have unfolded in the absence of the atomic bomb, and how the world's first nuclear monopoly slipped through America's fingers. So let's return to the summer of 1945. In our timeline, the world's first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th, followed by Nagasaki 3 days later. Within a week, Japan surrendered, and World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, finally ended. But in the alternate timeline we're exploring, that devastating weapon never worked. The Manhattan Project stalled. No mushroom clouds rose over Japanese cities. No sudden, shocking demonstration of a new era of warfare. So the question becomes, what happens next? The answer is grim. Without the bomb, the United States would have been forced to carry out Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of mainland Japan. And let's be clear, this wasn't just another battle. Operation Downfall was projected to be the largest, most brutal military invasion in human history. This operation was divided into two massive phases. First came Operation Olympic, targeting the southern Japanese island of Kyushu in late 1945. Then, assuming Olympic succeeded, the U.S. would launch Operation Coronet in early 1946, striking directly at the Kanto Plain, the heartland of Japan and home to Tokyo itself. But Japan was ready to defend itself to the bitter end. Despite being bombed relentlessly for months, Japanese forces were far from defeated mentally. Military leaders had planned Kitsugo, their last-ditch defense strategy. Under this plan, over 3 million soldiers and armed civilians would resist the American invasion. Schoolchildren, farmers, and elderly citizens were being trained to fight with bamboo spears, kamikaze attacks, and homemade explosives. Japan's rugged terrain, fortified caves, and urban centers would turn into deadly kill zones. American military planners feared the worst. Casualty estimates varied widely, but some projections predicted between 500,000 and 1 million U.S. soldiers killed or wounded in the invasion. And on the Japanese side, civilian and military deaths could have exceeded 5 to 10 million, as every town, city, and village became a battlefield. If you thought battles like Okinawa and Iwo Jima were brutal, imagine them on a national scale, across the entire Japanese homeland. And while this bloodbath unfolded, another major player was stepping onto the stage, the Soviet Union. In August 1945, right after Germany's defeat, the Soviets declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria, swiftly defeating the Japanese forces there. But if the war dragged on, Stalin likely wouldn't stop in Manchuria. He had his eyes on northern Japan, Hokkaido, and potentially even parts of Honshu. If Soviet troops had landed there before American forces, Japan could have been split down the middle after the war. Think about what happened to Germany and Korea, a communist north and a capitalist south. We could have had a divided Japan with Soviet-backed leadership in one half and American-backed leadership in the other. The Cold War in Asia could have started right there in 1946, not years later in Korea or Vietnam. Meanwhile, American forces would have continued their devastating firebombing campaign. Even before Hiroshima, U.S. bombers had flattened dozens of Japanese cities using incendiary bombs. Tokyo alone was reduced to rubble, with over 100,000 civilians killed in a single night of bombing in March 1945. Add to that the naval blockade, which cut off Japan's access to food, medicine, and industrial supplies. Starvation and disease were already spreading across the islands by mid-1945. In this timeline, without the sudden shock of the atomic bomb, Japan's leadership likely wouldn't surrender until late 1946, or even later, after enduring invasion, famine, and the total destruction of their country. Millions more Japanese civilians, soldiers, and Allied troops would perish in the process, and the aftermath? Asia's political landscape would look very different. If the Soviets had seized parts of Japan, Cold War tensions could have reached Japan's shores, not just Berlin or Korea. China, already embroiled in civil war between the communists and nationalists, might have seen stronger Soviet influence in the region. American forces would be stretched thin across Europe and Asia, rebuilding and occupying vast territories after years of fighting. And let's not forget the psychological toll. American soldiers, many already battle-weary after years of war, would have returned home not with the relief of a sudden victory, but with memories of months of savage combat in Japan's cities and mountains. The post-war world would have been far bloodier, far messier, and far more unstable. Instead of a sudden, shocking end to the war, the conflict would have ground on slowly and painfully, leaving scars that would last for generations. So, without the atomic bomb, the world might not have ended in a nuclear flash, but it would have drowned in blood, fire, and suffering just the same. In our real history, the United States' successful detonation of the atomic bomb at the Trinity test in July 1945, and its use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, did more than just end World War II. It transformed America overnight into the world's first and only nuclear superpower. For nearly 4 years after the war, the U.S. alone held the key to nuclear annihilation, a fact that shaped global politics, diplomacy, and military strategy. But in this alternate timeline, that moment of unrivaled power never happens. If the Manhattan Project failed, the U.S. would have emerged from World War II victorious, yes, but without its most terrifying trump card. The nuclear monopoly that allowed America to set the post-war agenda in Europe and Asia would be gone, and someone else, someone far less friendly to American ideals, might have taken the lead. Let's talk about the most likely candidate, the Soviet Union. Even during World War II, while technically an ally of the United States, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet leadership were deeply suspicious of American intentions. And they were already working, quietly but determinedly, on their own atomic bomb project, known as the Soviet Atomic Bomb Project, under physicist Igor Kurchatov and spymaster Lavrenti Beria. In our timeline, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, after years of reverse engineering American designs and thanks in large part to espionage inside the Manhattan Project. But without America building the bomb first, the entire playing field shifts. Freed from trying to catch up, the Soviets might have become the first nuclear power. Imagine Stalin holding the world's only atomic bomb in 1947. The geopolitical landscape would tilt hard in his favor. Eastern Europe, already under Soviet occupation, might have been fully absorbed into the Soviet Union rather than turned into satellite states. Western Europe, exhausted by war and without the American nuclear shield, could have fallen under Soviet pressure or even occupation. Asia, already a battleground of influence, might have seen communist revolutions spread faster and farther. China, Korea, Vietnam, maybe even Japan, if the Soviets had occupied part of it during the prolonged war with Japan. The early Cold War, instead of being a cautious chess match, could have become a brutal checkmate. The United States, instead of dictating terms at the founding of the United Nations, rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan, and shaping the post-war order through economic and military dominance, would have found itself scrambling to defend the Western Hemisphere. But the Soviets weren't the only possible contenders. Let's take a dark detour for a moment. What if Nazi Germany had succeeded first? Now, this might seem unlikely at first glance. Germany's nuclear program, led by Werner Heisenberg, was behind America's efforts during the war. But if the Manhattan Project failed early, and if Germany had survived longer in the war, perhaps fending off Allied invasions or keeping the Eastern Front from collapsing, their scientists might have had time to catch up. A Nazi atomic bomb would have been a nightmare beyond imagination. London, Moscow, and perhaps New York or Washington could have been targets for nuclear blackmail, or worse. A Nazi victory in Europe might have been sealed with a radioactive signature. Thankfully, the scenario is more extreme, but in a chaotic world, it's not impossible to imagine technology falling into the worst possible hands. Alternatively, what if the United States' failure had simply delayed nuclear development until another Western power stepped up? The United Kingdom, whose scientists were crucial to the Manhattan Project, could have built their own bomb, but lacked the resources for such a vast undertaking alone during wartime. France, devastated by Nazi occupation, would have been even farther behind. And while China was years away from nuclear capability in the real timeline, the instability of a post-war Asia could have accelerated their ambitions. But regardless of who got there first, one thing is clear: the nuclear arms race was inevitable. Once the genie of nuclear physics was out of the bottle, no nation on Earth was going to stop pursuing it. But instead of the U.S. starting the race at the front of the pack, in this alternate world, America would be struggling to catch up. And this changes everything. Every major geopolitical decision from 1945 onward would be different. The Marshall Plan? Maybe it never happens, or maybe Europe turns toward the Soviet Union for reconstruction aid. NATO? Without a nuclear-armed America, would European nations have trusted Washington to protect them? The Berlin airlift of 1948? Stalin might have forced the West out of Berlin permanently, daring them to resist his nuclear threat. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, and countless other Cold War flashpoints might have played out in favor of communist expansion, with the U.S. unable to respond with nuclear deterrence. The Cold War wouldn't have been a cold standoff. It might have turned hot much sooner. And imagine the psychological shift within America itself. Instead of emerging from World War II as the confident leader of the free world, the U.S. might have entered the late 1940s and early 1950s gripped by fear of a nuclear-armed enemy they couldn't match. Political paranoia, already intense during the Red Scare, could have been far worse. America might have seen its technological and military confidence shaken at its core, altering domestic politics, science funding, and foreign policy for decades to come. So in this alternate history, the nuclear bomb still reshapes the world. But it doesn't do so under an American flag. Instead, it becomes a weapon that empowers rivals, shifts alliances, and threatens democracies everywhere. And it leaves the United States scrambling to reclaim the upper hand in a race it thought it was leading, but never truly was. When we think of nuclear weapons today, most of us picture those haunting images: a blinding white flash over Hiroshima, the iconic mushroom cloud rising into the sky, the flattened cityscapes where tens of thousands perished in an instant. Those images didn't just mark the end of World War II, they shaped the way the world thought about nuclear weapons forever. But now, let's imagine a world without them. In our alternate timeline, the Manhattan Project fails. No bombs fall on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. No city is erased in a second. No black and white photographs of melted buildings, shadows burned into walls, or children with radiation burns enter our collective memory. And this absence changes everything. Without Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear weapons remain a theoretical terror, a weapon so far untested, unproven, and perhaps, in some minds, exaggerated in its power. Instead of being viewed as doomsday machines capable of wiping out entire cities, they are just another tool of warfare, like tanks, battleships, or fighter planes, but bigger. Think about it. In our real history, the horror of 1945 forced world leaders to confront the reality of nuclear warfare head-on. The images shocked the conscience of humanity. They sparked global anti-nuclear movements, inspired arms control treaties, and planted deep moral doubts in the minds of many generals and politicians. Even leaders like President Eisenhower, a career soldier, spoke of nuclear weapons with fear and caution. But in this alternate timeline, that moral reckoning never happens. The Cold War dawns not with hesitation, but with curiosity and ambition. The United States, the Soviet Union, and other rising powers view nuclear weapons not as a last resort, but as a possible first strike option. Why wouldn't they? Without the scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what's stopping them from thinking a nuclear strike could simply be a bigger, better artillery barrage? Let's take one of the most dangerous moments in world history: the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. In our timeline, both President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were haunted by the shadow of Hiroshima. They knew what nuclear war meant: not just victory and defeat, but the potential annihilation of millions of civilians. That shared fear stopped them from pushing the button. But in this alternate history, imagine a world where neither side fully understands what nuclear weapons will do, where both leaders, pressured by hawkish generals, might believe a limited nuclear strike on Cuba or Florida wouldn't lead to global annihilation, where escalation feels like a military strategy, not a moral catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis could have ended not with diplomacy, but with fire. Havana and Miami reduced to radioactive craters, Moscow and Washington possibly following soon after. And it wouldn't stop there. Other Cold War flashpoints take on darker possibilities. The Korean War. What if, facing stalemates at the 38th parallel, the U.S. dropped a nuclear bomb on Pyongyang, hoping to force a North Korean surrender? Would China retaliate with their own developing nuclear arsenal years later? Vietnam. What if President Johnson, desperate to break the stalemate, used tactical nukes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, believing it would win the war quickly? Would the Soviet Union answer in kind? Or would the radiation spread into neighboring countries and ignite a wider Asian conflict? So, the Middle East. Could the wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors have escalated to nuclear exchanges if either side believed the other might strike first? In this timeline, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, the grim understanding that a nuclear war would destroy both attacker and defender, might never take hold. Instead, leaders could believe nuclear war is winnable, that a first strike could disable the enemy before they had a chance to retaliate. That belief, reckless as it sounds today, could have driven one or both superpowers to strike first during any crisis. Ironically, the very horror that spared us from nuclear war in our timeline, the unbearable images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are absent here, and without them, the nuclear age becomes far more volatile and dangerous. The arms race might have been even more frenzied. Instead of careful steps toward disarmament, like the Test Ban Treaty or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, we might have seen even larger stockpiles, even deadlier bombs, and even lower thresholds for their use. The space race, too, could have taken on a darker edge, with the weaponization of orbit as a staging ground for nuclear strikes from space. And what about public opinion? Without the anti-nuclear protests of the 1950s and 60s, without the moral outrage of seeing cities destroyed, the American and Soviet populations might have been far more accepting of using these weapons in war. Nuclear war could have been normalized in popular culture and military planning alike. So in a strange twist of fate, the very horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as terrible as it was, may have been what saved the world from future nuclear wars. Take away that cautionary tale, and you open the door to reckless, unchecked escalation, wars that could have ended civilization as we know it. So, what kind of world would we have inherited if the Manhattan Project had failed? What would the long-term consequences be for America, for the Cold War, and for humanity itself? Let's start with the obvious. World War II would have dragged on, far longer and bloodier than in our real history. Instead of ending in August 1945 with Japan's surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war would likely have extended into 1946 or beyond. Operation Downfall would have unfolded with horrifying consequences, costing millions of lives and leaving the Japanese homeland in ruins. The psychological toll on both American and Japanese citizens would have been enormous, reshaping national identities and military doctrines for decades to come. But beyond the war, the most profound changes unfold in the decades that follow. Without the bomb, America's post-war dominance would have been very different. In our actual timeline, the atomic bomb became the symbol and the reality of American power. It allowed the U.S. to dictate the terms of peace, shape the post-war order through institutions like the United Nations, and build alliances like NATO with the assurance of a nuclear deterrent backing them. But in this alternate timeline, the United States emerges from World War II as a powerful nation, but not an unchallenged superpower. The Soviet Union, emboldened by its massive conventional army, and perhaps the first to successfully develop a nuclear weapon, could claim leadership of the post-war world. Soviet influence might expand deeper into Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, where countries searching for protection and stability could fall under Moscow's sway. American allies, feeling exposed and vulnerable, might seek neutral paths, or worse, align themselves with the Soviet bloc. A nuclear-armed Soviet Union with no American counterpart could embolden Stalin and his successors to act more aggressively in places like Berlin, Korea, Vietnam, or even Western Europe. The early Cold War would no longer be a cautious standoff, but a potentially explosive rivalry, with nuclear weapons possibly used as instruments of conquest, not deterrence. Alternatively, let's not forget Germany. While historically the Nazi atomic program fell far behind the Allies, in this alternate world where the war lasts longer and chaos reigns, the German nuclear effort might have found new life. If remnants of the Third Reich survived in fortified strongholds, perhaps in Norway, Argentina, or elsewhere, and eventually unlocked the atomic secret, the world would face a terrifying new axis of evil armed with nuclear weapons. Or perhaps the atomic breakthrough eventually comes from elsewhere. The United Kingdom, drawing on the talents of British physicists who had helped start the Manhattan Project. France, whose post-war government might have pursued the bomb faster without relying on American protection. China, where the Communist Revolution eventually succeeded, creating a superpower with both ideological drive and nuclear capability. But beyond military might, nuclear weapons also shaped global psychology. In our timeline, the sheer horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shocked the world into cautious respect for nuclear power. The images of devastation fueled peace movements, led to arms control treaties, and forced world leaders to think twice before using these weapons again. But without that horror burned into history, nuclear weapons might have been treated like any other military tool. Would we have seen limited nuclear wars in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, or even Europe? Would tactical nukes have become standard battlefield weapons, like tanks and artillery? Would humanity have crossed the nuclear threshold casually, not hesitantly? Ironically, it's possible that the failure of the Manhattan Project could have led to a darker, more dangerous world, where nuclear weapons weren't feared, but used, over and over again. On the other hand, there's another possibility. Perhaps the very failure of the Manhattan Project would have humbled humanity. Maybe the inability of one nation to master nuclear weapons alone would have sparked greater international cooperation. Fear of any single country, be it the US, the Soviets, or Germany, gaining nuclear supremacy might have driven nations to form multinational scientific councils or arms control agreements much earlier. Maybe the first successful nuclear test, wherever and whenever it happened, would have come under the watchful eye of a global community, not behind the locked doors of a single superpower. In that world, humanity might have approached nuclear power not as a weapon of war, but as a force to be controlled, contained, and limited in scope. The United Nations, or a new global body, might have played a far greater role in regulating nuclear technology from the very beginning. But whether this path of cooperation would prevail over the temptations of power is impossible to know. What we do know is this: the Manhattan Project was a pivot point in history. Its success gave rise to the nuclear age, the Cold War, and the global balance of terror that kept full-scale world war at bay, but at the price of constant fear and arms races. Its failure could have unleashed a world even less stable, where nuclear power emerged in unpredictable places, where the lessons of restraint might have been learned too late, or never learned at all. In the end, whether we like it or not, the atomic bomb shaped the modern world. It changed warfare, politics, science, and human morality. Without it, we might have had a longer war, a deadlier Cold War, and a more chaotic 20th century. Or perhaps, we might have had an era of caution and cooperation, where the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were avoided entirely. But one thing is clear: the failure of the Manhattan Project would have changed history in ways we can barely begin to imagine. The world we know, with its fragile peace, its constant threat of nuclear war, and its moments of unprecedented cooperation, might have been unrecognizable. And that leaves us wondering, did the bomb save us from something worse? Or did it unleash a shadow we can never escape? So, after hearing all of this, what do you think? Did the success of the Manhattan Project ultimately save lives by ending World War II quickly and creating a balance of power that prevented future world wars? Or did it open the door to an era of fear, destruction, and the constant threat of global annihilation? And if the project had failed, would the world have been better off without the bomb? Or worse, would humanity have found a different path to peace, or would another power have used the weapon without mercy? History doesn't give us easy answers, but it does give us the chance to imagine what might have been and to learn from it. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Iggy, wintit somos. Do you think the atomic bomb was a necessary evil or a tragedy we could have avoided? How do you think the Cold War, or even our world today, would be different if the US never built the bomb first? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's open up this conversation and hear your perspective. And if you found this video thought-provoking, please share it with your friends, your history buffs, and anyone who loves asking what-if questions about the world we live in. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, the past may be written, but the future is still in our hands. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I'll see you in the next one.